This video covers 5 really strong DLC bleed builds that you can get within 5 minutes of starting the DLC. The Backhand Blades, the Milady, the Great Katana, the Chicken Wing, and a 5th bonus bleed build featuring an OP-based game weapon. Each weapon and build fits a different playstyle. Each has its own fashion and function, so I recommend you watch the whole video to find a build that fits your playstyle before committing to one. So, before we talk about 2 weapons with amazing movesets and an incredibly strong bonk build, let's start with a weapon that has both, the Great Katana Samurai Bleed build. The Great Katana is part of a new weapon class introduced in Shadow of the Erdtree. This weapon requires some strength and dexterity to use, and it's much longer and does more damage than a typical katana. Its moveset is what you'd expect from a katana. The running light attack and follow-up has some pretty good reach, and the running R2 attack is a horizontal slash that could be used to hit multiple enemies at the same time. But where this weapon shines is its weapon skill, which is overhead stance. While it's not as strong as another Ash of War that you can find early game, which we'll talk about later, overhead stance is completely unique to great katanas, and a normal attack from this stance is a step forward and a slash downwards, or use a strong attack to deliver a series of 3 downward slashes while stepping forwards. The Great Katana also sets bleeding as a status effect build-up, which is also pretty great. In fact, I have the weapon on Occult Affinity because it scales really well on Arcane. And Arcane would increase your bleed build-up immensely. This is great if you previously used Rivers of Blood, since you won't need to change your attributes much. Even though Keen Affinity will increase your attack power by about 40, with Arcane scaling your blood loss build-up will be double what it is by default, so you're going to get a lot more bleed triggers if you go with the Occult route. However, if using Bloodflame Blade is important to you, remember you cannot use it with Occult Affinity, in which case you might want to go with Keen. The other Ash of War that you might want to give a try is the Savage Lion's Claw. This is an upgraded version of the Lion's Claw from the base game, allowing you to do 1 additional somersault when you hit L2 twice. It's really good at dealing damage and stance damage, and overall you'll find it more effective than overhead stance. However, it costs quite a bit of FP to use. But hopefully at this point in the game you would have enough FP to manage using Savage Lion's Claw. Now if you straight up want one of the strongest bonk bleed builds in the DLC, this is the Bloodfiends Arm build. The Bloodfiend Arm is a colossal weapon that deals physical damage and scales with strength, dexterity, and arcane. The heavy attack causes an AoE blood effect, which adds additional bleeding buildup. However, the effect doesn't occur if you're doing jumping or running heavy attacks. The weapon also comes with Endure as its default Ash of War. And while that's perfectly fine to use, an alternative could be the Royal Knight's Resolve, which buffs the damage of your next attack by a whopping 80%. So when combined with a charged heavy attack and some epic talismans we'll talk about later, your total damage output becomes incredible. Of course, you can never go wrong with a bonk build. Speaking of bonk, you could also use Cragblade. If you're going for a Poise Breaker build, Cragblade will also increase physical attack power by 15%. Now before the patch, Bloodfiend's Arm used to have S scaling on Arcane and used to deal 220 blood loss build-up, but now it only does about 205 bleed and only has A scaling on Arcane. I know, right? It's literally unusable now. I'm just joking, of course, it's still incredibly OP. So if you want maximum physical damage, go for the Occult Affinity. Or if you want very high physical damage plus blood loss buildup, go for the Blood Affinity. Whichever affinity you decide to go with, the main strategy with this build remains the same. Activate your skill of choice, charge up a heavy attack, and just bonk. But, of course, something you might be thinking is, the Bloodfiend's Arm is very boring. Well, let me present the Backhand Blades, possibly the most stylish weapon, maybe only second to the Milady. I don't know which one's cooler. The Backhand Blades have a really fast and deadly playstyle. The default Ash of War, Blind Spot, allows you to dodge and attack enemies from the side. The running R2 attack lets you hit 4 times in quick succession, 2 hits from each sword. This is pretty similar to the curved scimitars build we're going to talk about later. It also lets you carry through your sprint, which lets you be very mobile while attacking. You can also control the direction of your weapon skill with your sticks. which means you can use this to dodge attacks left or right, since it also has iframes. This skill reminds me a lot of Bloodhound's Finesse from the Bloodhound's Fang. The only downside is that the Ash of War consumes a lot of stamina, so you can't spam it in fights. However, you won't need to rely on it much, since the light attacks provide all the damage you need. You would only rely on the Ash of War for strategic dodges. So the ideal playstyle here is being able to continuously combo your attacks, and then to use your skill to dodge enemy attacks, and then continuing a combo of attacks again. This weapon scales really well on dexterity. At max upgrade, it has S scaling in dexterity, giving you a lot of damage out of the weapon. However, it doesn't have any native status effect buildups, which means you would either have to go for the blood infusion, in which case you're going to have lower damage, since you don't get that S scaling in dexterity, so you kind of have to decide whether bleeding is worth it to you, or whether you want to stick with maximum damage. Or alternatively, you can use Bloodfiends Blade to deal a lot of physical damage and build up bleed at the same time. However, if you're using Bloodfiends Blade, remember you cannot use it with Occult Affinity, in which case you might want to go with Keen, which might end up being better overall because of that S scaling on dex. So the backhand blades are really cool and stylish. But let me present another weapon, the Milady, that's just as fashionable and just as deadly. The Milady light greatsword is incredibly fast and fluid. Its very strong heavy R2 attack is where it really shines. When you press R2, it delivers 2 quick hits. If you press R2 again immediately after, it follows up with another 2 hits. This 4-hit combo is incredibly strong and allows you to build up attack power rapidly when using talismans that boost damage on successive hits. We'll talk about the talismans very soon, but first, your Ash of War, we're using Wing Stance. When activated, you hold your sword out to the side, looking absolutely intimidating and ready for action. Wing Stance combines well with a new talisman called Relana's Cameo. You'll notice if you hold this stance for about 2 seconds, you'll see the buff being activated. That is a 15% damage increase being activated right there. The heavy attack, on the other hand, performs a huge jumping slam attack. This move not only looks incredibly sick, but it also has hyper armor, making it great for trading hits with enemies. This heavy attack can also break enemy poise quite often. What's really cool about Wing Stance is how seamlessly you can chain these attacks into the weapon's regular moveset, which means you can keep up attack combos dealing devastating damage, while also looking chill and calm AF. The Milady scales really well on dex, but it has no native status effect buildups, which means you can choose which you want to go with. If you like to deal the maximum physical damage possible, then go with the Keen Affinity. This way, you deal over 300 damage with 80 dex. And you're also able to use spells like Bloodfiends Blade and greases like Blood Grease to deal high damage and bleed buildups at the same time. You could also go for a Blood Infusion build, in which case you're going to deal lower damage, but you're now able to proc bleed, which if you have enough points into Arcane might be a considerable amount. You can also go with Frost Affinity. Frost is an often overlooked, but it's incredibly strong. When Frost procs, it not only deals a chunk of damage, but also reduces the enemy's stamina recovery and damage absorption by 20% for 30 seconds. This debuff is especially useful against bosses in the DLC, who seem to have infinite stamina sometimes. The beauty of Frost is that it doesn't rely on any specific stat scaling, making it a flexible choice for various builds. In the case of our Milady Light Greatsword, we can focus on dexterity for damage while still benefiting from the Frost effect. However, if you prefer using Bloodfiends Blade, remember you cannot use it with Frost or Bleed affinities. Now, if you need an OP-based game build to get you into the DLC and maybe even carry you through it, here is an amazing Rivers of Blood build. This Rivers of Blood build will carry you through the endgame or even the DLC with absolutely no problem, especially with the talisman combination we've got going. With this weapon, your primary attack will be your skill, Corpse Piler. Corpse Piler has extremely long range and does bleed and fire damage. Rivers of Blood mainly scales on dex and arcane. The interesting thing about the scaling on this weapon is, even though arcane is scaled on D, you'll still come out ahead on damage, and as a bonus, arcane will increase your blood loss buildup, which means you'll bleed enemies even faster. Now, let's quickly cover the talismans needed. Luckily, most of these builds share talismans with each other, which makes switching between builds much easier if needed. Generally, a great talisman for these builds is the Shard of Alexander, or the Warrior Jar Shard if you're in early game. Either talisman will raise the attack power of skills by a percentage, and considering we're going to be using the weapon skill frequently, using one of these two talismans will always be a great buff. I'm also using the Green Turtle Talisman to be able to recover stamina 17% faster. Or even better is the Two-Headed Turtle Talisman, which will boost stamina recovery even faster. And finally, the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman to reduce physical damage taken by 20%, and the Bull Goats Talisman to raise your poise by 33%. Next, the Rotten Winged Insignia, or Millicent's Prosthesis, which would both increase your attack power by a percentage for every successive hit you deal. For the Bloodfiends Arm, you could also use the Axe Talisman, which would increase the attack damage of charged attacks by 10%, and the Two-Handed Sword Talisman, which increases damage of all attacks and guard counters performed when two-handing a single weapon by 15%. Finally, there's the Lord of Blood's Exaltation to increase attack power every time blood loss is triggered, which is probably going to be very often. In fact, this talisman stacks with the White Mask, which also increases your attack power by 10% for 20 seconds if something around you suffers from blood loss. Now real quick, let's go over the attributes required for all these builds. Remember, some stats can change based on your starting class, and these attributes you see on screen are the most optimal for a general player. Feel free to change it based on any spells or other alterations you're running in your builds. And feel free to ask me any questions in the comments below.